The morning of May 27, 1942, carried the scent of diesel fuel and salt water across Pearl Harbor. Metal groaned against concrete as tugboats guided a limping giant toward dry dock number 1. Her flight deck scarred, her hull weeping oil into the Pacific. USS Yorktown had traveled 4,000 miles from the Coral Sea, with wounds that should have killed her. Steam rose from twisted steel where a 500-pound Japanese bomb had punched through 5 decks, detonating in her bowels like thunder trapped in a cave. The carrier listed slightly to port, her crew exhausted, their eyes hollow with the memory of flames and screaming metal. Admiral Chester Nimitz stood on the dock, his weathered face betraying nothing as he surveyed the damage. Behind him, yard supervisors clutched clipboards and shook their heads. 3 months, they said. Maybe 4. The structural damage ran too deep, the repairs too complex for anything less than a complete overhaul at Puget Sound. But Nimitz had intercepted Admiral Yamamoto's coded transmissions. The Japanese were coming to Midway in 6 days, and without Yorktown, the odds would tilt impossibly against America. 4 Japanese carriers against 2. Mathematics that spoke of defeat. The Admiral's voice cut through the harbor noise like a blade through silk. 48 hours, he told the yard foreman. Not 49. Not 72. 48. 3 weeks earlier, in the coral green waters 1,000 miles northeast of Australia, Yorktown had danced with death. The Battle of the Coral Sea had been America's first taste of carrier warfare, where steel titans fought through their aircraft across distances so vast that their crews never saw their enemies' faces. On May 8th, Japanese dive bombers had found her flight deck. The first bomb struck near misses, concussion waves buckling plates and rupturing fuel lines. The second carved a hole in her port side, salt water rushing into compartments that had never known the sea's touch. But it was the third bomb that nearly broke her, punching through the flight deck near the island superstructure, tearing through 5 levels before exploding just above the 4th deck, killing 37 men in an instant of white-hot fury. Yet Yorktown had survived what her sister Lexington could not. The massive carrier, Lexington, pride of the peacetime Navy, had absorbed torpedoes and bombs only to succumb hours later to internal explosions that turned her into a floating pyre. As Yorktown's damage control teams fought fires and sealed breaches, they watched Lexington's final moments through smoke-stained portholes, the great ship disappearing. Beneath Pacific swells, in a column of black smoke that rose like a funeral pyre toward the tropical sky, the Japanese believed they had witnessed the destruction of 2 American carriers that day. Their pilots, returning to their own ships through the golden light of evening, reported with certainty. Both enemy flat tops destroyed. The intelligence filtered up through the chain of command, from squadron leaders to Admiral Takagi, from Takagi to Admiral Yamamoto himself. In the war rooms of the combined fleet, staff officers marked USS Yorktown as sunk. Their calculations for Midway proceeded on this assumption: 3 American carriers in the Pacific, with Yorktown resting on the ocean floor beside her sister. But Yorktown had limped away into the darkness, her crew working by flashlight to shore up bulkheads and pump out flooded compartments. For 19 days she had sailed eastward, trailing oil and nursing wounds that grew worse with each Pacific swell. Now she lay in Pearl Harbor's embrace, broken but breathing, while 1,400 shipyard workers gathered around her like surgeons around a dying patient. What followed defied every principle of naval engineering. In peacetime, such repairs would require months of careful planning, precise measurements, ordered deliveries of materials. But this was May 1942, 6 months after Pearl Harbor, and the workers of the naval shipyard understood that America balanced on the edge of a knife. They swarmed over Yorktown like ants rebuilding a damaged hill, working with an urgency that transformed craft into artistry and desperation into genius. The first challenge was her flight deck. The bomb had torn a jagged wound 20 feet across, twisted steel plates jutting skyward like broken bones. Cutting torches worked through the night, their blue flames casting dancing shadows on the harbor water. New steel plates arrived still warm from the mills, hoisted by cranes and fitted with a precision that amazed even veteran shipbuilders. By dawn of the second day, welders were sealing the seams, their sparks falling like dying stars into the dark water below. But the real work lay deeper. 5 decks down, in the compartments where the bomb had exploded, entire sections of the ship's skeleton needed replacement. Structural steel members bent and twisted by the blast were cut away and replaced with whatever could be found in the shipyard's inventory. Frame 104 was rebuilt using steel intended for a destroyer. Deck plates meant for a cruiser were cut and fitted to replace Yorktown's damaged sections. The ship's original blueprints became sacred texts, studied by flashlight in flooded compartments, where workers labored knee-deep in oil and seawater. The fuel tank ruptures presented another puzzle. Welding inside compartments that had held aviation gasoline required careful purging and testing, work that should have taken weeks reduced to hours through a combination of courage and calculated risk. Temporary patches covered the worst damage, designed not for permanence, but for the few days that might determine the war's outcome. The oil leak that had marked Yorktown's passage across the Pacific was stemmed with everything from steel plates to canvas and cement. Time compressed into a blur of grinding metal and roaring machinery. Electricians rewired damaged circuits by flashlight. Pipe fitters replaced burst steam lines with spares salvaged from other ships. In the machine shops, lathes turned 24 hours a day, creating replacement parts from rough steel stock. The shipyard's foundry glowed red through the night, casting bronze fittings and steel brackets designed on the spot to replace components too damaged to repair. On the morning of May 29th, less than 72 hours after entering dry dock, Yorktown's engines turned over with a deep, reassuring rumble. Her flight deck, scarred but level, could launch and recover aircraft. Her damaged compartments were sealed and pumped dry. She was not whole. Patches of mismatched steel and hastily welded joints marked her like battle scars, but she was alive. And she could fight. Admiral Nimitz walked Yorktown's flight deck that morning, his footsteps echoing on steel plates that had been molten metal just days before. Behind him, air group commanders from the carrier Saratoga briefed replacement pilots who would fly from Yorktown's deck. There had been no time to reassemble her scattered squadrons, so pilots who had never seen the ship before would take her aircraft into battle. They studied photographs of the carrier's deck markings, memorized the hand signals of flight deck crews they had never met, prepared to land on a ship that had been declared dead by everyone except the men who had brought her back to life. The Japanese, meanwhile, proceeded with their plans in ignorance of this resurrection. Admiral Yamamoto's fleet moved eastward from Japan, 4 fleet carriers at its heart: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Their pilots, veterans of Pearl Harbor and the conquest of the East Indies, prepared for what they believed would be a decisive battle against a weakened enemy. Intelligence reports confirmed their expectations. The Americans could muster only 2 carriers, Enterprise and Hornet. The ship they had sunk at Coral Sea would not rise from the dead to complicate their calculations. Admiral Nagumo, commanding the carrier strike force from his flagship Akagi, reviewed his battle plans with confidence born of 6 months of victory. His 4 carriers could launch over 200 aircraft in a single strike. The Americans, with their 2 remaining carriers, could manage perhaps half that number. The mathematics of naval aviation were brutally simple. More planes meant victory, fewer planes meant defeat. Nagumo had more planes. On May 30th, Yorktown slipped her moorings and moved into Pearl Harbor's main channel. Behind her, the twisted wreckage of battleships still marked the harbor bottom, monuments to American unpreparedness. Ahead, lay the vast Pacific, and an enemy that had dominated every sea from the Aleutians to the Coral Sea. As Yorktown's bow cut through water that still leaked oil from ships sunk 6 months before, her crew understood they sailed toward a battle that would either vindicate their desperate repair work or render it meaningless. The carrier joined Task Force 17 at Point Luck, a coordinate in the empty Pacific Northwest of Midway Island. Enterprise and Hornet were already waiting, their flight decks crowded with aircraft, their crews tense with the knowledge that Japanese radio transmissions had been intercepted and decoded. The enemy was coming. 4 carriers, fast battleships, cruisers, and destroyers in numbers that dwarfed the American force. But the Americans had one advantage their enemies did not suspect. They knew when and where the blow would fall. June 3rd passed in final preparations. Pilots checked their aircraft. Armorers loaded bombs and torpedoes. Radar operators tested equipment that would give American fighters crucial minutes of warning. On Yorktown's flight deck, mechanics worked on engines that had been installed just days before, using parts and tools assembled in the frantic rush at Pearl Harbor. Everything about the ship felt improvised, patched together, held by will as much as steel. Yet she floated. Her engines ran. Her catapults functioned. She was ready. Dawn of June 4th brought the sound American ears had learned to dread, the drone of aircraft engines approaching from the northwest. Japanese bombers and fighters, launched from carriers still beyond the horizon, swept toward Midway Island in the war's opening gambit. But this time, American radar tracked their approach, and American fighters rose to meet them. The battle had begun. What the Japanese did not know, could not know, was that their careful intelligence had failed them at the crucial moment. 3 American carriers waited in the dawn light, not 2. The ghost ship they had killed at Coral Sea rode the Pacific swells, her patched hull cutting through water that reflected the morning sun like scattered diamonds. USS Yorktown, risen from the dead through American steel and stubbornness, prepared to launch aircraft toward an enemy that had already written her obituary. At 0600 hours, Yorktown's flight deck exploded into controlled chaos. Aircraft engines roared to life. Plane handlers pushed fighters and dive bombers toward catapults. Pilots strapped themselves into cockpits of machines that might carry them to glory or death. Squadron leaders checked their watches against the ship's chronometer, synchronized their attack with Enterprise and Hornet. In the flag plot, Admiral Fletcher studied the tactical situation through intelligence reports that revealed Japanese positions with startling accuracy. The enemy's codes had been broken, their plans laid bare. Now came the test of whether knowledge could overcome numbers. The first American strike launched at 0700, torpedo bombers and fighters lifting from 3 carrier decks toward coordinates where Japanese carriers should be found. Behind them, dive bombers prepared for a second wave, their armor-piercing bombs designed to punch through flight decks and detonate in the hangars below. Everything depended on finding the Japanese carriers while their aircraft were elsewhere. Caught in the vulnerable moment between launching and recovering their strike groups, at 0925, the impossible became reality. American dive bombers arriving over the Japanese fleet at the precise moment when enemy fighters had been drawn down to sea level by brave but doomed torpedo attacks, rolled into their dives from 14,000 feet. Through breaks in the morning clouds, they saw the 4 carriers of Admiral Nagumo's force spread across the blue Pacific like a deadly constellation. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled for a second strike on Midway. The Americans dove through flak that rose like deadly fireworks, their aircraft shuddering under the impact of shell fragments. At 2,000 feet, they released their bombs and pulled out of dives that pressed them deep into their cockpit seats. Behind them, 1,000-pound bombs fell toward ships that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months. The first bombs struck Akagi near her island superstructure, detonating among aircraft armed and fueled for takeoff. Secondary explosions rippled across her flight deck, as aviation gasoline ignited in sheets of flame that rose higher than her masts. Within minutes, the flagship of the Pearl Harbor attack force had become a floating furnace. Kaga died next, 3 bombs transforming her flight deck into twisted steel and flame. Soryu followed seconds later, her hangar deck erupting as bombs found aircraft and fuel in a chain reaction of destruction. In less than 10 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers that had dominated the Pacific War lay burning and helpless, their flight decks impassable, their aircraft destroyed, their crews fighting fires that could not be contained. Only Hiryu survived the American strike, protected by distance and clouds from the diving bombers. But survival meant the responsibility of revenge, and Admiral Yamaguchi, Hiryu's commander, immediately prepared a counterstrike. His remaining aircraft, fewer than 40 bombers and fighters, launched toward the American carriers with orders to inflict maximum damage on enemies they could not yet see. The Japanese strike found its target at 1200 hours. Hiryu's dive bombers, guided by radio intercepts and the instincts of experienced pilots, located the American task force spread across 30 miles of ocean. They selected the nearest carrier, a flat top that showed recent battle damage, patches of fresh steel marking her flight deck like scars. To Japanese eyes, she appeared to be Enterprise or Hornet, one of the 2 American carriers their intelligence had identified. They could not know they had found the ship their own bombers had killed at Coral Sea, the ghost carrier that should not exist. Yorktown's radar detected the incoming strike at 40 miles, her fighters scrambling to intercept bombers that approached through scattered clouds and brilliant sunshine. The carrier's guns opened fire at maximum range, 5-inch shells bursting among the enemy formation like black flowers against the blue sky. But enough Japanese aircraft broke through the defensive fire to begin their attack runs, diving toward a flight deck that bore the scars of their earlier success. The first bomb struck Yorktown's flight deck amidships, its explosion lifting steel plates and hurling debris skyward. The second hit near her island, penetrating to the hangar deck before detonating among parked aircraft. Fires spread through the ship's superstructure as damage control parties fought blazes that threatened to consume her from within. For a moment, it seemed the Japanese had finished what they had started at Coral Sea. Yorktown's flight deck buckled. Her communications failed. Black smoke poured from her wounds. But the ship that had been reborn in Pearl Harbor refused to die easily. Her damage control teams, trained in the harsh school of Coral Sea and refined by weeks of emergency repairs, fought the fires with a skill born of experience. Emergency generators restored power, temporary communications were rigged, and within an hour Yorktown was recovering aircraft again. To her crew, she was wounded but alive. To observers at distance, she appeared to have shrugged off damage that would have crippled lesser ships. This resilience would prove crucial when Hiryu launched her second strike 2 hours later. 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters, the last offensive strength of the Japanese carrier force, swept toward the American fleet with orders to finish the carrier they had already damaged. But when they arrived over the target area, they found what appeared to be an undamaged American carrier operating normally, her flight deck clear, her aircraft landing and taking off in routine fashion. The Japanese pilots could not reconcile what they saw with what they knew. They had bombed an American carrier 2 hours before, leaving her burning and crippled. Now they found a carrier that showed no damage, no signs of the battle they had just fought. Their training and doctrine provided no explanation for this apparition. Some concluded they had found a third American carrier, unknown to intelligence. Others believed they faced Enterprise or Hornet, which had escaped damage through superior seamanship. None suspected they had encountered the same ship twice. First damaged, then repaired, a testament to American industrial skill and sailors' courage. Hiryu's final strike pressed home their attack with the desperation of men who knew they represented Japan's last hope. Their bombs struck Yorktown again, 2 hits that penetrated to her 4th deck and detonated among her boiler rooms. This time, the damage could not be quickly repaired. The carrier lost power, her speed dropped to 6 knots, her flight operations ceased. Yet even as she slowed and listed, her guns continued firing, her crew continued fighting. Her very existence continued to confound Japanese calculations. Admiral Nimitz, from the burning bridge of his flagship Akagi, received reports that defied comprehension. His pilots claimed to have sunk 2 American carriers, possibly 3. But American radio intercepts suggested the enemy still possessed significant striking power. How could this be, when intelligence had confirmed only 2 enemy carriers in the entire Pacific? The answer lay in the resurrection they could not imagine, the ship that had returned from death to balance the scales of battle. As afternoon wore toward evening, the last act of the drama unfolded. Yorktown's aircraft, launched before her 2nd wounding, found Hiryu racing northward in a desperate attempt to escape American vengeance. The Japanese carrier, alone now after the destruction of her 3 sisters, launched her remaining fighters in a final gesture of defiance. But American dive bombers broke through her defenses as they had broken through the defenses of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. 4 bombs struck Hiryu's flight deck in quick succession, each detonation another nail in the coffin of Japanese naval aviation. By sunset of June the 4th, all 4 Japanese carriers lay dead in the water, their flight decks twisted ruins, their aircraft destroyed, their crews abandoning ship or fighting fires that could not be controlled. The force that had struck Pearl Harbor, conquered the East Indies, and terrorized the Pacific for 6 months had been destroyed in a single day's fighting. The balance of power in the Pacific War had shifted irrevocably, turned by aircraft launched from 3 American carriers, one of which should not have existed. Yorktown herself would not survive to celebrate the victory. Japanese submarine I-168, prowling the battle area for targets, found the wounded carrier 2 days later as salvage crews attempted to save her. 2 torpedoes struck her port side, the explosions breaking her back and flooding her engine rooms. This time, there would be no resurrection, no miracle of repair. Yorktown slipped beneath the Pacific swells on the morning of June 7th, her battle flags still flying, her mission complete. But her ghost lived on in Japanese nightmares and American legend. In the war rooms of the combined fleet, intelligence officers struggled to explain how their pilots had encountered 3 American carriers when only 2 existed. The Phantom ship haunted their calculations for months afterward, a reminder that their intelligence networks had failed at the crucial moment. They had fought a battle planned around incomplete information, engaging an enemy they did not fully understand. The Americans, meanwhile, understood exactly what had been accomplished in those desperate hours at Pearl Harbor. 1,400 shipyard workers, laboring around the clock with salvaged materials and improvised solutions, had built victory from the bones of defeat. Their tools had been cutting torches and welding rods, their blueprints sketched on scrap paper, their materials whatever could be found in the warehouses and scrap piles of a naval base still cleaning up from its own disaster. Yet they had created a weapon that changed the course of history. In the years that followed, as American shipyards launched carriers by the dozen, the miracle of Yorktown's repair became footnote to larger triumphs. But those who lived through June 1942 never forgot the lesson written in fire and steel across the Pacific. That wars are won not only by the courage of those who fight, but by the skill of those who build, repair, and sustain the instruments of battle. The hands that welded Yorktown's wounds were as crucial to victory as the hands that flew her aircraft into combat. The wreckage of Yorktown lies today 3 miles beneath the Pacific, her broken hull a monument to the men who fought and died aboard her. But her true memorial stands in the principle she embodied, that defeat is not final until hope is abandoned. That resurrection is possible through determination and skill. That the impossible becomes inevitable when necessity meets capability. Japanese commanders had been stunned to face a carrier they believed destroyed, but their amazement paled beside the quiet pride of the shipyard workers who had made the impossible real. In 48 hours of continuous labor, they had restored more than a ship. They had restored the balance of naval power in the Pacific, tipped the scales of history, and proved that American industrial might could match American courage when the stakes demanded nothing less than perfection. The sound of hammers on steel had become the sound of victory itself, echoing across Pearl Harbor and into a future where America would never again be caught unprepared, never again doubt the power of its builders, never again underestimate the strength that lies in the marriage of human skill and national will. In the end, Yorktown's resurrection had been more than a feat of engineering. It had been an act of faith, a declaration that democracy's weapons could be rebuilt as often as tyranny destroyed them, that freedom's arsenal would never be empty as long as free men had hands to build and hearts to endure.